Turn your Bibles, if you will, to 1 Corinthians chapter 4. 1 Corinthians 4. We continue our study in this book written to a church with a lot of problems, a lot of issues here at Corinth. And the first issue takes 4 chapters to deal with the subject of preacheritis. And just to quickly remind us, Paul said in chapter 1 that the gospel is not a humanly devised wisdom. In chapter 2, it is a divinely revealed wisdom instead. And then in chapter 3, he turns to the preachers themselves, looking at how we're supposed to view the preachers. Chapter 3 and chapter 4 both. How we're supposed to view the preachers so that we don't put them on a pedestal and get puffed up for one against another is the idea. And so that continues and concludes in chapter 4. And the first 6 verses here, he restates the proper view or proper perspective of preachers. Verse 1, let a man so consider us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required in stewards that one be found faithful. But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by a human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself. For I know of nothing against myself, yet I'm not justified by this, but he who judges me is the Lord. Therefore judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the hidden things of darkness and reveal the counsels of the hearts. Then each one's praise will come from God. Now these things, brethren, I have figuratively transferred myself into Apollos for your sakes, that you may learn in us not to think beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up on behalf of one against another. So he's restating the appropriate view of preachers. In verse 1, particularly 2 thoughts. Let a man so consider us being Paul and others who preach the gospel. Let a man so consider us, number 1, as servants of Christ. Not lords, but servants. Not people to be put on a pedestal, but servants. And number 2, stewards of the mysteries of God. 2 questions. What are the mysteries of God?
The gospel.
That's the gospel, that's right. That's what was revealed. It was a mystery, and now it's revealed. And he just uses that phrase to refer to the gospel. What's a steward?
Servant. It'd be a manager.
A manager, yeah, that's a good word. He is a form of a servant, for certainly, but the specific area of service is like he's a manager of the affairs of another. And in this context, stewards of the mysteries of God, stewards of the gospel. That gospel belongs to God. And the apostles and others who preach are simply stewards of it. And so God has entrusted those of us who teach with the gospel. And so that brings us to the next verse. Moreover, it's required in stewards that one be found faithful. A preacher's obligation is to be faithful to the word, or any teacher, Bible class teacher, whatever. His obligation is to be faithful to the word. Faithful not just in his life, but faithful in teaching it, making sure it is taught properly and taught accurately. So that's a big job. There's a lot of responsibility to that, but he's not someone to put on a pedestal. He's a servant and he's a steward. So that's in contrast to the attitudes they had, where I'm of Paul and I'm of Apollos, and they were putting these guys on pedestals and using them as sources of division. He says that's not the case at all. We're all servants of Christ and we're stewards of God's word. Now in verse 3 through 5, he talks about, and this gets back to the I'm of Paul and I'm of Apollos, because in effect that's a judgment. If you say you're of Apollos or you're of Cephas, you're saying you're not of Paul. And so there must be something wrong with Paul, is the idea. So Paul's talking about his assessment of their judgment. And there's actually, and if you think about it, there's 3 judges in these verses. The judge within, the judge without, and the judge above. So think about that as we read through this. But with me, verse 3, it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by a human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself. For I know nothing against myself, yet I'm not justified by this, but the one who judges me is the Lord. And let me stop there and point out the 3 judges. It is a very small thing that I should be judged by you. That's the judge without. There's always people outside looking at you, okay? And so you've got the judge without. And then he says, I don't even judge myself. That's the judge within. That's your conscience. You looking at yourself. Did I do right? Did I do wrong? How do I feel about that? And then verse 4, the one who judges me is the Lord. That's the judge above. So 3 judges, the judge within, the judge without, the judge above. And Paul says, in terms of your judgments of me, it's a very small thing. I don't really care what you think one way or another. It's a small thing. Your opinion of me is a small thing. Why? Is it because he doesn't care about them?
It doesn't really matter in the end.
In the end, it doesn't really matter. That's right. In the end, your assessment of me or whatever, your other preacher, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's not going to carry any weight in the final judgment. Your assessment means nothing weighed against the final judgment. Okay? So it's a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by a human court. In fact, I don't even judge myself. Now, of course, there's a sense in which you do judge yourself. You know, Paul said later in the 2 Corinthian letter, examine yourselves. Well, that's a form of judging. Examine yourselves whether you're in the faith. But Paul is driving at a point here. I don't even judge myself because, verse 4, the word for there means because, I know nothing against myself. Now, the old King James says by myself. That's an archaic expression. We don't use the word by in that sense anymore. But the word by simply means against. And that's why most modern speech versions will change that, because we don't speak in the King's English anymore. We don't speak in 1611 English. We speak in 2023 English. So it should be translated, I know nothing against myself. I've looked at myself and I don't see anything wrong. Sometimes that can happen, isn't it? You know, I look at myself, I examine, I don't see anything wrong. But is that going to get you off on the judgment day? No. Nope, that isn't going to matter either, see? That isn't going to, you might not see anything wrong, but that doesn't mean God doesn't see anything wrong. Sometimes when we look at ourselves, we put on the rosy-colored glasses. We color our thinking and we color our views of ourselves, and we think we're all right. That's usually the case. Most of us think, well, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm all right. It's everybody else. It's him and it's her and it's them. That's the problem. So he says, I don't even judge myself. I'm not aware of anything against myself, but I'm not justified by this. That's not going to get me into heaven. That's not going to remove my sins. Because I don't see anything wrong doesn't mean there isn't something wrong. Ultimately, the one who judges me is the Lord. That's the judgment you got to be concerned about. There's the judge within, the judge without, and the judge above. That leads us to verse 5. Therefore, judge nothing before the time. What time? Until the Lord comes. See that? So he's telling you what the time is. Judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes, the second coming of Christ, who will both bring to light the hidden things of darkness and reveal the counsels of the hearts. You know, you can look at somebody and you can say, he's a pretty good fellow, but there might be secret things. That's what he's talking about there. The hidden counsels of the heart, the hidden things of darkness. There are things that others don't know about. There are things that others may not see in you, flaws that others may not see. And so their assessment is not enough to get you over the hump as far as the judgment is concerned. There are hidden things of darkness. There are counsels of the hearts. There are things that people think that you don't have any idea that they think it. God knows, though, and he will pass judgment on that. So the most important judgment is the judgment that comes from God. There are judgments that come from without. There are judgments that come from within. They have their place to a point, but they're not going to weigh much in the final judgment. So the Lord's judgment is what matters. So judge nothing before the time when he comes. He will bring to light the hidden things of darkness and reveal the counsels of the hearts. Things you think nobody knows and nobody will ever know, oh, it's coming out at the judgment. It will be disclosed. It will be revealed. Unless, of course, it's forgiven by the blood of Christ. When it's forgiven, the Lord puts that away. He doesn't hold that against you anymore. It will never be brought up against you. That's what forgiveness is. But the important thing is to be ready. And each one's praise will come from God. It will be appropriately given and deserved or not deserved, depending on how you've lived your life. Okay. Then verse 6. Now these things, kind of a summary here. These things that I've been talking about for the last 4 chapters, I figuratively transferred to myself and Apollos for your sakes. Now I think what he's saying here is, because I think it's true that they did have people saying, I'm of Paul and I'm of Apollos. That's clear in chapter 1. So when he says, I figuratively transferred to myself and to Apollos, he's saying, I'm using us as examples of how you should view all preachers. See us all as servants of Christ. See us all as stewards of God. See us all as co-laborers in the kingdom. See us in the right way. So I've transferred this to myself and Apollos so that you may learn in us, through what I've said about the two of us, not to think beyond what is written. Now the Old King James says, and there's some reason for this, it says not to think of men. And you notice the words of men are in italics. Not to think of men beyond what's written. The reason that's put there is because of the context. Remember, I am of Paul and I am of Apollos, not to think of men beyond what's written. So the King James adds that, I think justifiably so, but the real statement is not to think beyond what's written. So there is a standard here by which all men will be judged. This is what's written. We can't go thinking beyond that. We're not smarter than this. We're not smarter than God. And so we can't think beyond what's written. And then leading on to his point about preacheritis, that none of you may be puffed up on behalf of one against another. I'm of Paul, and therefore I'm not of Apollos. See, one on behalf of one against another. So he says you don't need to be thinking that way. That's wrong thinking. That's stinking thinking that needs to be discarded, gotten away from your minds. Pour that out of your minds. Get rid of that kind of thinking. Okay. Questions, comments on the first 6 verses?
But when you think about it, when he makes that analogy or whatever of being stewards, how well that applies is because, I mean, a steward that's over a man's affairs, dealing with his daily affairs or whatever, he just has authority over what the owner tells him. Here's your job, here's what to do, this is, He don't make all, it's not ultimately his decisions on things. And that's the way we are. All we can do is what God has given us to do. I think of it as elders. We can help and do what we need to do, but we can't make laws.
Right.
We can't initiate, here's the new plan we're doing. God has given us what we're to do. And that's the way with these preachers. All they can do is teach what God has given them to do. And if they're doing it, they're not one against another. They're all teaching God's plan. And
right. They're all the same team,
Yeah.
not competitors. And to your point, he says in Titus 1:7, a bishop must be blameless, talking about elders, as a steward of God. So elders are stewards. Preachers are stewards. We're all stewards in a sense, and you could take that whole subject of stewardship and make a broad application of it. We're stewards of our time. We're stewards of our treasures, our money. We're stewards of our responsibilities. We're stewards of souls. We're stewards of the Gospels. You can go in a lot of places with that. God has entrusted us with certain things, but ultimately we're going to answer to the big boss, to the Lord. I've given you this. It's like the parable of the talents. I've given you these talents. I've given you these obligations and responsibilities. What have you done with it? Have you used it properly? Have you used it biblically? Or am I going to have to bring judgment upon you for mishandling my things? So that's very important. Now, starting in verse 7, he gets kind of harsh with the Corinthians for just a moment. And you could even say sarcastic. He uses sarcasm in these verses. And you'll see it here in a moment. But sometimes people say, we shouldn't use sarcasm. Well, I'm sorry, Paul used it a lot. He used it a lot, and he's about ready to use some right here. Now, sarcasm can be misused and used improperly, but Paul uses it, and if inspired man can use it, then there's a legitimate use for sarcasm, and he's going to use it right here in just a moment. But he says in verse 7, who makes you differ from another? And what do you have that you did not receive? Now, he takes stock in your life for a second. Who makes you different? If you have some ability that someone else doesn't have, who gave you that ability? God did. There you go. You don't need to be puffed up about yourself. If you can do something that someone else can't do, and that makes you different from him, okay, God gave you that ability. So don't be puffed up. So who makes you differ? God did that. What do you have that you didn't receive? You got anything that you didn't get from God? Is there anything that you've got in your life you didn't get from God? That's not true, is it? Everything you've got came from God, ultimately. You may have worked for it, but God gave you the talent and ability to work for it. So it ultimately comes from God. So, middle of verse 7. Now, if you did receive it, if it was a gift and blessing from God, why do you boast as if you hadn't received it? Like it's just your own will and your own power and your own ability. Why do you boast? And then here comes the sarcasm in verse 8. Oh, you're already full. See, That's what they thought of themselves. You're already rich. Well, you've already got everything. See, he's getting sarcastic with them. You're already full. You've reigned as kings without us apostles. What? Look at you. Look how full you are. Look how rich you are. Look how kingly you are. Now, here's how we know it's sarcasm. The rest of the verse. And indeed, I could wish you did reign. I wish that was true. It's not true, but I wish it was. But that's what you think of yourselves. And so Paul is sarcastically throwing that right back in their face. Oh, you think you're really something, don't you? You think you're full, you think you're rich, you think you're kingly, but you didn't have any of that if it wouldn't be for God. You wouldn't have any of that if it wasn't for God. I could wish that you did reign. I wish you were as big as you thought you were. I wish you were as great as you thought you were, so that we might reign with you. So in that verse right there is some strong sarcasm directed at the Corinthians. Get off your high horse. Stop thinking so highly of yourselves. Stop dividing one from another and get together in unity is really what he's driving at here. For I think, now starting here, he's going to contrast their inflated egos and views of themselves with the true status of the apostles. For I think God has displayed us, the apostles, last, as men condemned to death. For we have been made a spectacle to the world, both to angels and to men. Paul says, now here's the reality. We apostles have been put at the bottom of the heap by the Lord. And we've been made a spectacle. The word spectacle has to do with the old Roman theater. You know, you've seen like the Roman Colosseum, and everybody would come into the theater and be sitting around, and down there in the middle is the spectacle. That's what everybody's looking at. That's the show. And so we've been made a spectacle to the world, both to angels and to men. Now there's that spiritual realm we studied about, remember? Angels are even watching. Angels are watching what goes on here amongst us, okay? So we've been made a spectacle to the world, both to angels and to men. We are fools for Christ's sake. Oh, but you, here comes some more sarcasm. Oh, but you are wise in Christ. We are weak. Oh, but you are strong. You are distinguished, but we are dishonored. And Paul's saying, can't you see the discrepancy here? That we're so low and lowly doing the Lord's service, and you all think so high and mighty of yourselves, you see. So this is some really digging sarcasm at these people. They're not really strong. They're not really distinguished. They just think they are, okay? And he's really taking a blow here at their inflated egos. Verse 11, for to the present hour we both hunger and thirst, we are poorly clothed, beaten, and homeless. Now he says, that's what it means to be a disciple, because the world hates you, and the world turns on you, and the world persecutes you. And sometimes you don't have anything to eat, and sometimes you don't have any clothes, and sometimes you're mistreated, and sometimes you don't even have a home. They would burn the homes of Christians sometimes, run them off, run them out of town, burn their homes down. And so this is what it means to be a disciple in the first century. Aren't you grateful that we don't have to live that way? Worst thing we have to put up with right now that could change, but right now the worst thing we have to put up with is some being made fun of. We can take that compared to what they put up with from their contemporaries. And we labor working with our own hands because they don't have anything, so they got to work and earn it, you see. Being reviled, we revile in return? No, we bless. Being persecuted, we persecute back? No, we endure. Being defamed, we entreat, which means we encourage. So they defame us, we encourage them. Okay? We have been made as the filth of the world and the offscouring of all things. Now he's talking about the world's estimate of Christians and of the apostles in particular. They think that you're the filth of the world. They think you're the offscouring. And you know, that's still true today. People think, oh, those poor, ignorant, dumb, Bible-thumping fundamentalist Christians. Oh, how terrible. It's just awful that they're that dumb, that they believe in a God out there somewhere, and they believe he created all this in 6 days, when we know it was done differently. We know it was done by evolution. So you have this same attitude that Christians are seen as the offscouring of all things, the scum of the world or the filth of the world. That's the way the world sees you. And so be it. Because remember what he said earlier, it doesn't really matter what others think. The judge without, they can say what they want, but that doesn't change anything, does it? God is the one who ultimately judges. Now, he's going to bring it back to reality here in verse 14. I do not write these things to shame you, but as my beloved children, I warn you. I'm not just trying to make you feel bad. I'm trying to warn you, because this arrogance that you have right now is taking you down a bad pathway here. And so I'm treating you like my beloved children. Now, Paul wasn't married and Paul didn't have any children, but he saw Christians as his children, figuratively. And he's going to bring it out in the next verse. But he saw Christians as his children. And so I'm not just trying to shame you and put a guilt trip on you, but I'm trying to warn you about where you're headed. Verse 15, for though you might have 10,000 instructors, you may have had 10,000 different teachers come in, Paul and Apollos and Cephas and others, but you don't have many fathers. For in Christ Jesus I have begotten you through the gospel. Paul says, I'm the one who started that congregation. Remember way back in chapter 2? And I, brethren, when I came to you. Paul rolled into Corinth in Acts 18. He's the one that started the church there. He was their father in that sense. Through the gospel, he begot them unto the Lord. He begot them as children of God. So in that sense, he was their father. He was concerned. So sometimes as a father, you have to get tough with your kids. Sometimes you have to say some hard things. And that's what Paul is trying to explain here. I'm saying some hard and harsh things. I understand it, but I'm not just trying to shame you. I'm trying to warn you and get you back on the right path. That's why I'm using the harsh language. That's why I'm being so tough right now. Okay. Questions or comments?
Is that why some preachers that kind of do that today in that same way?
Yeah, I think so. I think sometimes. Now, before I say that, I'll say that some preachers are just mean and ornery. That's true. But I don't think most preachers are that way. And I think when they come off mean and heartless and cold, it's because of concern. You know, I see these trends in the church. I see these trends among brethren. I'm concerned about your soul. So I'm going to get up here. I'm going to wring it out hard, and it may step on a few toes, but it's because I care. I think that's what you're driving at. It's because they care that they get harsh and direct and bold sometimes. It's not because they don't care. On the contrary, it's because they do. And it's the same way you would do with a little child. If you were across the room and you saw a child crawl up and get ready to stick his finger in a light socket, and you hollered and nothing happened. And so the next thing you're going to do is run over there and smack that little child in the hand. That's a harsh thing to do. But you did it not because you don't care, but because you do care. I don't want you to get electrocuted. Don't stick that penny in the light socket. That's going to get you hurt. So if you're not going to listen to my screaming, I'm going to come over and slap that little hand, and it might hurt. And it might get red. And it might even swell up a little bit, but at least you won't be electrocuted. So it's the same way with preaching sometimes. Sometimes you got to slap brethren on the hand, so to speak, to keep them from losing their souls. Anything else? Okay. Verse, where did I leave off? 16. Therefore I urge you, imitate me. So here Paul sets himself up as an example. And he does this often in his writings. And he'll do it again in chapter 11 when he says, imitate me. But in chapter 11, he adds a little caveat. Imitate me. Remember the rest of it? As I imitate Christ. So it's not just imitate me no matter what, but imitate me when you look at the whole picture, every time he said it in every context, it's imitate me as I imitate Christ. So Paul's saying, I want to be an example to you. And so to the extent that I'm following the Lord, then you need to follow me. Okay. Now, verse 18. It's clear that Paul's getting ready to make a visit to Corinth. At least that's in his plans. Whether or not he actually ever did or not, I'm not sure. But he's clearly intending to come. And some are puffed up. He's still getting at their arrogance here. Some are puffed up as though I were not coming to you. So all Paul's just boasting. He's not coming. He's not going to take time out of his busy schedule, come all the way over here to Corinth and deal with us. And so they're puffed up, and they think they can get by with some of this stuff that they're doing, the division and all that stuff. But Paul says, verse 19, but I will come to you shortly. I am coming, and I'll get there. Notice, if the Lord wills. That kind of tracks with what James said. Today or tomorrow we'll go to such and such a city, spend a year there, and buy and sell, make a profit. And James said, you ought to say, if the Lord wills. It's not the words that are important. It's the what? It's the meaning behind it. Yeah. It's not that you have to say, if the Lord wills, if the Lord wills, if the Lord wills every time you say something. It's just the understanding that this is only going to happen if God allows it to happen. You can make all the plans in the world, but God may have other plans. And sometimes God can throw monkey wrenches into our plans. So if the Lord wills, I will come to you shortly. And I will know when I get there. Not the words, not the big puffy, loud, arrogant speech. Not the words of those who are puffed up, but the power. Paul's getting ready to say, show me what you got. I'm coming there, and I'm going to deal with all this problem. I'm going to deal with this division, and we're going to see what you got. You got any power? Can you work miracles? Can you strike a man blind like I can? Let's see who's got the real power. Okay? So that's what he's driving at here. We're going to find out who's really an apostle of the Lord when I get there. Remember, especially in the second letter, they're doubting his apostleship. Actually, in this first letter, they doubt his apostleship, and he has to kind of establish his apostleship. But he said, we're going to find out who's really got the power here. It's not going to be just your words, your puffy words. We're going to find out who's got power. For the kingdom of God is not in word, but in power. Now, he's talking about miracle-working power here, divine power, which backed up the message of the apostles. And I love verse 21, and it kind of makes a bridge into chapter 5. What do you want? Shall I come to you with a rod, or in love and a spirit of gentleness? How you want it? How you want the gospel? I'm coming. How you want it when I get there? Do you want me to preach in love, or do you want me to get the rod out and start disciplining people? Is that what you want? Because I can do it. I've got the power, and I can do it. You know, Paul struck people blind on occasion. He did in what happened to Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5. Dropped dead on the spot. And Elymas the sorcerer struck blind by the Apostle Paul because he tried to oppose the gospel. Paul said, I got the power. Let's see what you got when I get there. And how you receive me and how you accept me when I get there is going to determine what you get. And that kind of goes back to your point earlier. What kind of preaching you get is going to depend on how it's received. How do you want it? You want it in love, or do you want it with a rod? How you want the preaching? And that's going to depend on how you respond to it, how you react to it. See, that's the idea. So I think that's just a very forceful way to end this. And Paul is saying, get this division stuff under control. Stop it. Stop this arrogant thinking, puffed up on behalf of one against another. Stop it, because I'm coming there, and we're going to find out when I get there who's really got power. And, of course, underlying all that is, it's me, the Apostle Paul. It's me. Paul's got the power. He's got the miraculous power. Questions, comments on this?
Did you get verse 17, or did I go off somewhere?
Did I skip over it?
Yeah.
I did, didn't I? Well, thank you. Thank you. I did skip right over that.
I'm afraid it was me.
No, I didn't. No, you're right. You're right. I just skipped right over that. Let's go back and look at that. Verse 16, for context, I urge you imitate me. For this reason I have sent Timothy to you, who's my beloved and faithful son in the Lord, who will remind you of my ways in Christ as I teach everywhere in every church. So before Paul comes, he sends Timothy ahead to kind of prepare the groundwork and make sure everything's going well. So I've sent Timothy. I treat Timothy as a beloved son too. He's that close to me. He's just like my own son. And he's going to remind you of my ways. Now that links up with the previous verse, imitate me. And Timothy, when he comes, he's going to remind you of my ways. He's going to remind you of how I live my life and how I teach the gospel and all of this. And then that little phrase, as I teach everywhere in every church. That's an important principle. Paul is saying here that the same message is taught in every congregation. That kind of links us back a little bit to our Wednesday night Bible study. Remember, we talked about the copiers of Scripture, and they would copy them and keep a copy and then send it on to the next church, and they would copy it and send it on to the next church, because the same message, whatever Paul said to Corinth, he could say to Rome. Whatever he said to Rome, he could say to Ephesus. We don't have a different message for each church, which, what do you see today? In different churches, you see different messages, depending on what church you go to. But in Bible times, one message, same thing in every church. And Paul didn't go to one church, teach one thing, go to another church, teach something else. It was the same message. So we have a consistent message in the gospel. And Timothy was going to remind them of that and remind them of the consistency of the message.
And also, by saying that, helps deal with the situation of what he's already been dealing with of the, I'm Apollos. No, we're all teaching the one message.
We're all on the same team. So we don't need to have the Paul team and the Apollos team and the Cephas team. And remember too, when we were back in chapter 1, Paul and Cephas and Apollos didn't start those teams. It was the brethren who did that. Paul and Cephas and Apollos knew they were on the same team, but it was the brethren who tried to make some kind of difference about it. Now, verse 21, we were talking about a while ago, makes a nice bridge into chapter 5, because he's talking about discipline there. Shall I come to you with a rod? That's a rod of correction, a rod of discipline. Shall I come to you with a rod? And of course, it's figurative. Paul isn't literally going to walk in there with a rod and smack people around with it. That's not what he's going to do. But he's talking about the rod of discipline here. But that makes a nice lead into chapter 5. And I'm not going to get into the details of chapter 5 till next week, but just kind of set it up a little bit. In chapter 5, they've got this disciplinary situation that they have let go, and they've not done anything about. And it's too late now for all of the you go and talk to him, and then you go and talk to him, and then let's all go and talk to him. It's too late for all that. You've waited too long. And I learned something. It took me a lot of years to learn this. I don't remember if I've preached that sermon here yet or not. I think I have. But it took me a lot of years to learn this. But in the Bible, all of the passages on discipline are different. They're all different. We preachers have some time, and I used to do it too. They've tried to take all them discipline passages and make them all fit into one single Church of Christ disciplinary code. But every one of them's different. In one passage, Jesus says, if your brother sins, what? Go. And then take two more, and then to the zero. In this passage, there's none of that. Deliver them over to Satan. Now, there's no going and talking. There's no taking one or two more with you. No, we're past that. Too late for that. So there's one step, deliver him over to Satan. One step in the process. Okay? In Titus 2, a man that is a heretic, after the first and second admonition, reject. So notice, first and second admonition, reject. 3 steps. In the Matthew passage, you go, you send 1 or 2, you tell it to the church, and then he's like, that's 4 steps. And so when you start looking at these, they're all different, depending on the situation, depending on the circumstance. And there are some things that can be worked with longer. I'm not saying it's right, that what they're doing is right, but I'm saying there are some that require patience and long time instruction to get somebody around to a certain point. And then there are others that are so obvious, like this guy having sex with his stepmother is so obvious, there's nothing to talk about here. There's nothing to discuss here. It's wrong. Everybody knows it's wrong. So sometimes, and this is important because sometimes people look at elders, well, why are they dealing with this guy so harshly, but here's this guy over here? Well, there may be a different circumstance over here. Understand, they're working with it. I know, been there, done that. I've been an elder. I know they're working with it. But this one over here is so clear cut and done. It's a done deal. This one over here, they're working on, and it takes a little bit more time depending on circumstance and situation. Not everybody sees that on the outside. They just see, well, this looks harsh over here, and this doesn't look harsh over here, but you don't know all the facts. I guarantee you don't know all the facts. Because like I said, I've been there and done that. I know this from experience. So I wanted to set that kind of up before we got into the actual text itself. But I want you to understand here in 1 Corinthians 5, there are no steps. Except, well, I should say there is. There's one step. Deliver him over to Satan. There's no you go talk to him, go knock on the door, and you take 2 minutes. There's none of that here in 1 Corinthians 5. Because this was so obvious and so blatant of a sin. I mean, think about it. Guy having sexual relations with his stepmother. I mean, everybody knows that. He says the Gentiles don't even do that. They know it's wrong. They don't even do that. What are you doing putting up with this? But then overall, why is it so important that churches exercise discipline? Just on a broad principle here.
One thing, you can nip it in the bud when it first happens.
Yeah, you can
Can't let the stuff keep going.
Yeah, you can nip it in the bud.
The shame that it brings from without too.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
Because, I mean, how are you gonna try to talk somebody and convert somebody to come with you when they see you or others among you and all this, you know, those people that Corinth that knew this situation, you know, that was on the outside,
Yeah.
how would you get them converted?
Yeah.
When they see this situation, they say, no, I ain't wanna be part of that.
Well,
The
so
shame
many
that
of
would
them
be.
says, I don't wanna go there. They've got hypocrites in there, does what I do, but why do I don't-
Yeah, and then there's that little, everything everybody said is good, and then there's that little principle there in verse 6, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. If people get wind of the fact that you can get by with sin,
Yeah.
then everybody's gonna be doing something, eventually.
How to keep the church pure.
Yeah, it keeps the church pure, and then you don't have that leavening effect, where people say, well, if he can get by with that, I can get by with this. And everybody starts trying to justify sin on the basis of what's tolerated, see? So there has to be a line drawn in the sand, that this is not acceptable, this is not tolerated. At the same time, we just got about 30 seconds here, but at the same time, there's also an understanding, and that'll be brought in from other passages, but if someone's disciplined and you come across them, what should you do? Ignore them? Admonish them. Yeah. Sometimes people think that discipline is an excuse to snub your nose at somebody, not talk to them ever again, and refuse to shake their hand. Oh, please, what's the matter with you? Of course you should shake their hand, and of course you should talk to them and admonish them. You should use the opportunity. But sometimes we use that as an excuse to be rude and insulting to people, and I think that's missing the point. And I'll hush because the time's up. Chapter 5 next week.